History as it happens, October 19th, 2021. The origins of ROTC.
Each and every day you stand up for our country. And you do it with honor, and you do it with courage, and you do it with commitment. So on behalf of a grateful nation, let me just say that we're proud of you. We honor you. We thank you for your service, and we thank your inspiring families as well.
In America, members of the military are held up as heroes, praised by politicians, honored in ceremonies before football games. But there was once a time when many Americans feared what they called Prussianism. And we can find this fear in the story of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, whose birth took place in a bygone era that exists only in long-forgotten congressional testimony before the U.S. became a military power. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This was the whole debate, and a very important one, over imperialism. Are we going to become an imperial power? Are we going to acquire non-contiguous territory?
So I'm a big football fan. I watch the New York Jets every Sunday on TV. I suppose that makes me a masochist, not a fan, considering how good the Jets are. But anyway, I actually haven't been to a game in a long time, probably 15 years. If I recall, before the game began, the 70,000 or so fans were treated to an elaborate ceremony to honor the troops. Now, after 9/11, it became commonplace before sporting events to have Air Force flyovers, massive American flags stretch from one end zone to the other, and for veterans to be introduced over the PA system. And it wasn't easy to question those shows of patriotism when we were fighting the war on terrorism. But shows they were. The Pentagon paid NFL franchises to hold those pregame ceremonies, as Senator John McCain remarked in 2015.
Along with sports fans across America, I was appalled to learn last month that many of the ceremonies honoring members of our armed services at NFL games are not actually being conducted out of a sense of patriotism, but for profit in the form of millions of dollars in taxpayers' money going from the Department of Defense to wealthy NFL franchises.
So the exchange of money for patriotism was one problem, but something else started to bother me too. About feeling compelled while in a crowd to mindlessly stand and salute. Because I eventually saw the war in Iraq, the war on terrorism, as a national disgrace, nothing to be proud of. But such pregame rituals conditioned us not to raise any uncomfortable points. You have to always support the troops, and if you question the war, you then undermine the men and women in uniform, or so the argument goes. And that's what I mean here. I direct no anger or antagonism at the soldiers and veterans standing at the 50-yard line, saluting the flag during the national anthem. It's about understanding how we got to this place, where it became necessary to show your patriotism before a football game, of all things, when, a century ago, many Americans would have bristled at the thought. Those Americans feared Prussianism, militarism, placing the armed forces on a pedestal immune from criticism, and they did not shy away from voicing those dissenting views. You know, sometimes a sliver of a story can illuminate the larger dilemma, and the sliver we're going to talk about today is the ROTC, created in 1916 but whose origins go back to the 19th century. So let's talk about it with my friend, Ithaca College Professor Emeritus Paul McBride, a specialist in 20th century American history and an ROTC graduate himself many moons ago. Paul McBride, welcome back.
Well, I'm delighted to be back, Martin.
As our dedicated listeners know, centuries ago I took some of your history classes at Ithaca College. We came up with the idea for this episode in some of our recent conversations about how we, meaning the United States, got to this point, a permanent war, a military empire, etc. And you began researching the origins of ROTC after serving as an officer in Vietnam. Paul McBride from conservative, Catholic, Youngstown, Ohio, wound up an officer in Vietnam. How did that happen?
Well, that is a kind of an interesting story because, as you pointed out, I came from a very conservative Catholic family. In fact, my mom and dad were both very pro Joseph McCarthy. I was taught in in grade school and high school, both Catholic schools, to such an extent that I was sure that the term godless atheistic communist was all one word. And so I had no objections in the 60s. I had no objections to our being in Vietnam. When I went to Youngstown University, they had a voluntary ROTC program, and they paid you $100 a month to join it. And they said with a wink that was for the maintenance of my uniform, and everybody knew that meant you had spending money. So I went through ROTC, became an officer, and they gave me time to go on for my master's degree, which I did, and they reeled me in, and I ended up starting active duty in 65. Now, the big issue then was not Vietnam, it was the Dominican Republic. We were involved in battle in the Dominican Republic. And by the way, 65 was also the year that LBJ sent in the Marines. And so the war was widening dramatically in that time. So I ended up in Vietnam in 1966 as a civil affairs officer.
And did you want to go?
Oh, I had no objection whatsoever. I had no objection to Vietnam. We were fighting the communists. That's as far as my analysis went, except that I was interested in the topic. So I was doing a lot of reading in the popular journals. I subscribed to the New Republic then, that was still in its liberal phase. And so there was a lot of critical articles that I was coming in contact with, but I was going to Vietnam and I didn't have an objection to that. Now, what Vietnam did for me was to very quickly confront me with the obvious reality that we didn't really quite know what we were doing. We didn't have any grip on the culture of the people. And so I came out of my experience in Vietnam very much opposed to our presence there. I joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I was an activist in the Antiwar movement, but that didn't turn me against my country. It's just that I thought we were making a ghastly mistake.
You once related a story to me about an officer who gave you a presentation in Vietnam. He put up a map that had something like color-coded zones, and he said something akin to, this is the commie zone or the red zone.
That was when I first got into Vietnam. Our very first day, we had briefings by a whole range of people, including the CIA. They had a couple of men, they identified themselves as part of the, quote, funny part of the embassy. We were supposed to think that was a nice joke. And they gave a presentation that was troubling in that it seemed so amateurish. But the person who gave the talk about why we were in Vietnam was General Walt. He's the commander of the Marines in I Corps. And he came out with the red surge was covering all of Asia, and we're standing up against this. And me and my fellow officers, we kind of just looked at each other because it was so sophomoric. Yeah. That was the first thing that got me thinking, what the heck is going on here? But yeah, and indeed, it was General Walt himself who was giving that presentation.
Yeah, that image has stuck in my mind. So you're back in the U.S. in 1967, right?
That's right.
And you were not a far left opponent of the war, meaning you weren't out there romanticizing Ho Chi Minh.
No, not at all. But it's interesting. I went through the matriculation process at University of Georgia when I started my doctoral work there in 67. And as I went through, the SDS had a table up. The table had a picture of Captain Levy. And Captain Levy there had been a big case at Fort Gordon where I was. After I got back from Vietnam, I was still in the military for a number of months. The Captain Levy case had worldwide attention. He was a medical doctor who refused to go to Vietnam because he said what we were doing in Vietnam was politicized medicine. We were giving medical assistance to people on one side, but denying it on the other. And he said this is against his Hippocratic oath. He wouldn't go. And the military court-martialed him. It became a worldwide case. And I knew Blair Schick, who was one of the prosecuting attorneys. He was a captain, but we're both young officers. And he and his wife came over to our home a number of times. And he was telling me kind of the insides reasoning. He was pleading with his superiors, let this guy go with a general discharge because it's creating way too much controversy. It's hurting the Army, and get this thing over with. Well, instead they convicted him and sent him to prison. Here I am going through matriculation, and this table is up with a picture of Captain Levy being led out of the court in handcuffs. And at that time, the the motto for the Army for recruitment was the new Army. And so they had that as the underpinning. I thought, I got to know these people because they know what they're talking about. That's how I got into SDS and the whole anti-war movement.
Students for a Democratic Society, right? SDS?
Yes, yes.
So I guess the first question that I should have asked you was, how did conservative Catholic Youngstown, Ohio native Paul McBride become an anti-war opponent or an anti-war activist? You just answered that. Activist might be too strong a word, or?
No, I was very much an activist on the University of Georgia campus, and it involves what we're getting into in today's discourse. The ROTC at University of Georgia was mandatory. So every male student that came into the university had to take ROTC for the first 2 years. And the result of that was, here we are in the 60s, and there's a lot of anti-war feeling, especially among college students. And so kids were being forced into military classes, and they're trying to get their degree in history or biology or whatever. And yet, every course they took in military science had academic credit. And so they could get an F in map reading 104, and it would prevent them from being on the dean's list. And there was all kinds of disciplinary problems. You could get into a lot of trouble with the college because you were having trouble with ROTC. And that raised my interest in the ROTC and a kind of a lifelong interest in this unusual marriage between two of our great and important institutions, the military and the academy. We found out, for example, that the Morrill Land Grant Act that had founded military training in the academy that came in 1862, that act required all the land grant colleges to offer military training, but it didn't have to be mandatory. They had to offer it. And in those first years, all the way through to 1916, the marriage was really pretty rocky because our military was really the dregs of society for much of those who came into the military. And the result was that the people who got assigned to the academic marriage were really ill-fitted for it, and the kids made fun of them, and nobody would take it. But by 1916, two things had happened. One is, of course, in 1914, World War I had broken out. But then in March of 1916, Pancho Villa came across the border into Columbus, New Mexico, killed a number of Americans, including some soldiers, burned the place, and then took off. And we sicked General Pershing on him. And Pershing had an expeditionary force that went traipsing around in Mexico for the next number of months trying to find Pancho Villa and never did it. And then, of course, we got into the war ourselves in April of 17. And so for the previous 3 years or so, a massive movement in America for preparedness. We've got to be prepared in case we get into this war in Europe. And there were preparedness parades in major cities. There were anti-preparedness parades also in major cities, because getting into the war was extremely contentious. There was a massive peace movement led by people like Jane Addams and Henry Ford, for example.
He went on a peace mission to Europe.
That's right. And so it was an extremely contentious issue. And in the midst of this, Congress came up with the National Defense Act of 1916. And this was going to strengthen the military and do some other important things.
Yeah, I do want to get into the National Defense Act of 1916. I want to back up for a moment, though, Paul, if you don't mind my interjecting here. Just a little bit more about the context in which the Land Grant College Act of 1862 was passed. The United States Army really wasn't much of an army.
As Abraham Lincoln was very quickly to find out, because there was no clear authority in the federal government for a massive military presence and a long history of being very leery of a standing army. So our image of military preparation was kind of the Minuteman. If something turns up, why, our people will volunteer, we'll put out the fire, then they go back to their farms and so on. And so what Morrill did was almost inadvertently about military. It was really an attempt to create a network of academic institutions whose primary focus was engineering and agriculture science. And so this very important law allowed the government to give to each of the states thousands of acres of federal land that they could use to sell and use the money to establish land grant colleges or to expand other colleges and make them land grant colleges. Cornell did that, for example. It was a private institution, but with the Land Grant Act, it expanded into a land grant college too. And to this day, it's two different colleges in one. Well, anyway, the result was that all of these states in the North, we were at war, of course, so it didn't take effect in the South yet. And so they established universities that concentrated on engineering and agriculture science. And there was a clause that Morrill put in. It said something like, and not to exclude military science. So these schools also had to offer military science. That's where this marriage began. And it wasn't until 1916 that ROTC, a formal program backed by the United States government with plenty of money and force behind it, was passed. And they had hearings in both the House and the Senate. And together we're talking about thousands of pages of transcript. And I read all of those. And it was fascinating because it doubled the size of the Army, it doubled the size of the National Guard, it gave the federal government more authority to bring the National Guard up and federalize it, and thereby ending the idea that someone like Teddy Roosevelt will create his own troops and just volunteer.
That was in the Spanish-American War.
That was in the Spanish-American War, yes, of course. And one of the most contentious parts of this act was ROTC. People from all over the country came to these hearings and testified. John Dewey strongly opposed bringing the military into the academy because, on the one hand, the academy is for free exchange of ideas. On the military side, it is you believe what we tell you, and if we tell you, you say yes, sir. The two institutions on the issue of free exchange of ideas and so on can be very much at odds. The head of the National Grange shows up. I can't remember what state he was from, and he testified vigorously against it. He said, look, if I send my kid to college, I don't want him to become Prussianized. Of course, he was referring to what was going on in Europe and the powerful military influence in Germany where there was mandatory service, So it was extremely contentious, but it passed. In June of 1916, by the way, it also created a new arm of the military for air service, the origins of our Air Force, and it created a division of the U.S. Signal Corps because radio was just being invented, and the military immediately saw that this was terribly important for battlefield communications. And so when we got into World War I in April of 17, Cornell University, for example, had a classified program under the military at Cornell on radio.
Wow.
And it was classified. Only certain students could get into it. But the most important thing, let me add this, it created the National Research Council. The National Research Council was, in its words, to conduct research into mathematical, biological, and physical science aspects of defense. That is the origins of what Eisenhower later was to warn us about, the military-industrial complex. So this is an important act.
Yeah, it planted the seeds. You mentioned Roosevelt before. I think we should, before we dive even deeper into 1916, just touch on the mindset at around the time of the Spanish-American War. The United States, up to that point, really had no overseas possessions, hadn't really fought many overseas wars. And people such as William Jennings Bryan did not want the United States to have an empire.
This was the whole debate, and a very important one, over imperialism. Are we going to become an imperial power? Are we going to acquire non-contiguous territory? And this came in the context of Alfred Thayer Mann's book on the importance of naval power in international affairs. And so on the one hand, there were those who were saying, look, we need these coaling stations and naval stations, not only for our military, but for our economy. These will be coaling stations for American shipping to all parts of the world. And the debate was really furious between 1898 and the very early part of the 20th century. and the anti-imperialist side obviously lost.
Yeah.
Now, that
alert.
leads right into the next tremendous debate over preparedness. Do we want to be prepared to go into World War I? Teddy Roosevelt was one of the leaders in demanding that we do it. General Leonard Wood, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was another major figure. In the Ivy League, the Plattsburgh movement had emerged. This was students at elite universities who would get together for summer camps and learn the art of arms. And they were trying to push hard for preparedness, getting us up to world standards in military abilities. And again, it was a debate that those who were saying, no, we want to be neutral. We want to stay out of putting all this money into the military. We don't want to increase military influence in American life. And they lost this debate. The Act of 1916 was passed, and within a matter of months, we were in the war, and that changed everything.
You mentioned it was June of 1916 when the final passage took place. The battle at Verdun had already been going on for several months, so Americans knew. I mean, this wasn't just happening in a vacuum. Americans could see what was happening. Not literally see it on their TVs on CNN, of course. We're talking 1916. But they knew that millions of people had already been killed, literally millions of people already killed and wounded, missing in the war, a war that was shattering Europe. And at this time, Woodrow Wilson is still promising to keep the United States out of the war.
He kept us out of war.
While
right?
Congress is debating the National Defense Act of 1916. And that's an important dynamic. So these hearings are going on, and I assume because there are all these different people, different constituencies showing up to testify for and against, that there must have been many members of Congress, too, who had their doubts about this.
Oh, it was very contentious indeed. But in the context of World War I, the United States was neutral in word only. We were really pro-ally. We were pro-England. Our own press coverage was decidedly pro-English. And on the other side, we depicted the Germans as near beasts for what they were doing. And the Kaiser was vilified. So we were really not neutral. And that created a real favor in America for, if we get into the war, we're going to end this German militaristic threat to the world. In Congress, there was a lot of pro-preparedness sentiment. It was by far the more powerful of the two forces.
Yeah. And it was also a clash of values, something you mentioned in one of our recent conversations. There was a real concern on the part of many people about the Prussianization of the youth of the country. And there was a popular song in those days titled, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier."
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dared to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy.
There was a prominent and active left in our country at the time. So all these values were clashing as well, right?
And that was about to change dramatically. Yes, we had a number of socialist mayors and socialist governors. Socialism didn't have the terrible meaning that has invaded it since the Russian Revolution introduced us also to communism. And so in the American mind, these two things get all balled up. And there was a very strong, as I said, very strong peace movement to keep us out of this war. But the war came and it dramatically changed everything. The Postmaster General shut down almost all of the left-wing press, wouldn't allow the males to carry their newspapers and so on. The Attorney General made war on left-wing organizations like the IWW. Federal government sent Eugene Debs to prison because he made an anti-war speech. There was an enormous anti-German feeling. My mother was German, went to a German Catholic parish in Youngstown, and during her childhood, they were forbidden to carry on classes or to give sermons in German in the German Catholic parish. Cornell University suspended their German department during the war. It changed everything. And what really brought this to my attention, I was researching the origins of ROTC and especially the Cornell University archives, because Cornell was a major player in the ROTC movement. and its president, Jacob Gold Sherman, was a proponent of ROTC. I had just read these thousands of pages of contentious hearings. And as I was doing it, I came across something about in 1926, there was a bill before Congress to abolish ROTC. I had never heard of it. So I immediately sent off through the interlibrary loan to get the hearings. I wanted, good Lord, I wanted to see them. Well, they finally arrived. It was a single document of several hundred pages. And I read them quickly, and it was astonishing. Whereas all of the anti-ROTC sentiment and the representatives of the anti-ROTC contingent were treated with respect and even some awe when people like John Dewey testified in the original hearings in 1916. In the hearings in 1926, I believe it was 26, they were held in utter contempt by every single congressman. The questions were rude. The accusations were that they were traitors to their country. They're turned against the military. And the bill didn't get out of committee. So it went nowhere. And that was a kind of a dramatic moment for me. I realized, I'm living in a world by this time, teaching at a college, where the military is enormously influential and powerful and money behind it in quantities that we can hardly imagine. And yet, as recently as 1916, that would have been unthinkable.
That's right.
And I think that 1916 to 1920, those years, changed things so astonishingly. Every war brings out powerful conservative forces. In the aftermath of World War I, we had the Republican ascendancy with Hoover, Coolidge, and Harding, and we broke the labor unions and so on. And the left wing did not get back up on its feet in the 1920s. Not until the 1930s brought the Depression did the left wing begin to reemerge. And so that's understandable. But the change in attitudes toward the military specifically just was night and day between 1916 and 1920.
It seems rather unlikely that today such a piece of legislation would get a hearing to eliminate something like ROTC.
Think of what happened when we had a commission a few years back to close military bases. And the result was mayhem, because every base had a community in America that went ballistic. That base brought millions of dollars into their communities.
You mentioned the changes in politics and national temper in the 1920s. The First World War by that time or U.S. involvement in it was already viewed as a mistake, right? I mean, didn't the nation already have regrets about getting involved in that war?
In World War I?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. In fact, there was a very strong isolationist movement in the 20s. We had hearings in Congress about what brought about our involvement in the war, because in the aftermath of the war, of course, we turned against the League of Nations. We never ratified the Versailles protocols. Our hearings turned up the thesis that what really got us into war was the war munitions industry that became very powerful and made billions of dollars on the war in the 1920s. And so there were competing reactions to the war. And those that were saying it was a mistake fed the rise of American isolationism that raised the dickens with FDR's efforts to get us prepared for World War II once it broke out in Europe in 1939. But it also created, as I suggested, powerful conservative, patriotic pressures in American life that dovetailed into a lot of other things. We virtually destroyed the labor union movement in the 1920s. The IWW, of course, virtually disappeared. I understand they still have offices in New York City, but we were only dealing with the conservative unions, the AFL skilled unions, and they were weakened dramatically. The 1920s has to be reassessed because it is a critical period, because all of these important changes in America that has created the America we're in now were bubbling in indecision in the 1920s.
Speaking of the America we're in now, to my earlier point about the impossibility of such a measure today to eliminate the ROTC, the House Armed Services Committee, I believe it was, added money to the military budget beyond what the Biden administration had requested on or about the same day the United States had completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan. So the annual defense budget is in the area of $750 billion a year, 700 to 800 bases on foreign soil. I think this is a good segue to talk about our current moment. It's been a theme on some of my recent episodes, Paul. Listening to you describe this contentious moment in 1916, who do we want to be as a country? Do we want to be an imperial power? I see it today. I do see people asking that question today, but it doesn't penetrate the mainstream.
Well, years ago, when Linda and I were still living in Ithaca, but retired, Ithaca College had a program where all the freshman class had to read the same book. And then in the beginning of the semester, they had faculty and staff and invited guests lead discussion groups with the students. So I don't remember what the book was, but here we were discussing it with a number of freshmen. The whole thing came up about the militarism in American life. And I asked the students, I said, how many military bases do we have, do you believe, on foreign soil? And one of the kids who seemed to be really up with it, he was really interested. He had taken a vigorous part in the discussion so far, had read the book clearly. He said, well, maybe 30. And I said, well, that's right. If I had asked the question, how many bases do we have on Okinawa? The truth of the matter was we had over 800 military bases then on foreign soil. And it cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion every single year to keep these bases up. And the defense budget you just mentioned for 2020 is $778 billion. That's more than $750 billion for 1 year. Now, we're having a terrible battle right now over okaying $3 trillion for the modernization of America, for things that we haven't done for the last century. And yet we're talking about $750 billion a year for the military. And you've got to ask, what kind of a nation could spend that much money on defense? Even that word is misleading.
It's euphemism.
That $778 billion represents more than the rest of the next 10 countries combined. Now, by the way, China in 2020 spent $252 billion. India 73, Russia 62, the UK 59. So we're spending more than all of the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. So defense is an odd word to say there. If we turn the tables around and imagine China or Russia having 800 military bases on foreign soil, including a number of countries in Latin America, 3 or 4 of them in Canada, 2 in Mexico, but they said, hey, we're nice guys, don't worry about us, we're worried about you. We would be going ballistic. We almost went to nuclear exchange in '62 over the Cuban Missile Crisis because we would have had one foreign country having a military base in the American lake, the Caribbean. And we almost had a nuclear exchange over that. And yet we don't think, in fact, we don't even know that we have these many bases. And that's in addition to about 4,000 bases, 1,000 in the United States.
Yeah, I've been using 700, 800, 900. My numbers may not be precise because it is difficult to know for sure how many. Keeping track of the Pentagon's budget has been very difficult for journalists for a long time. The
Yes.
way it's, I guess one reason why this isn't questioned anymore is because it's become prosaic. And I often think about how we as people become conditioned to do things like honor the military before NFL football games. And this is not to denigrate any individuals who are enlisted, but just that public ritual, almost like a loyalty test. This was, of course, in the years right after 9/11. There'd be flyovers and enormous American flags covering the entire football field and solemn moments with the national anthem. And my point is, what larger purpose is served by these rituals? Do they really condition us not to question things as they are?
That's the question, because we're talking about not just the expenditure of money, but the changing of American culture. Our culture has now become such that I think you're absolutely right. For someone to raise in a negative tone questions about the military is to end their political career. That's alarming. It's alarming. Part of the issue is ignorance. When that young student said 30 bases, you would get that kind of an answer for 9 out of 10 people walking the streets. As far as I know, there has never been a congressional hearing examining this issue where people were called in to testify, that it got in the papers, and we were discussing, for example, do we need 800? Would 400 be enough? In these 800 bases, 170 of them have golf courses. And so when we figure out the expenses, we have to have schools for our kids. We have to have schools for the kids of the thousands of American citizens, not military personnel, who come to help us run these plants. We have to have housing for our wives and children. Now, these are only for the big military bases. We have medium-sized bases that if you get assigned to them, you don't bring your family with you. Their expenses is less, but nonetheless, from the standpoint of the country involved, we see ourselves as great military heroes that are saving the world for democracy. Somebody in that country sees a GI on the streets drunk as hell, or knows someone down the street who got their daughter raped, or 2 people who were killed down the street because somebody from the base was driving carelessly, or they can't even hear themselves think because there's helicopters all over the place. They're not going to have a positive view of the United States. The idea behind it, by the way, is that we have a forward strategy. We want American military in as many places in the world as possible so that if something breaks out, we have a military response ready, rather than wait until they're at our shores, right? But the blowback from this has been enormous, and we've got to look at it.
The supposed lesson learned after those first 2 world wars was we cannot afford to allow ourselves to fall in a state of unpreparedness. Well, what are the costs of being, quote, always prepared to go to war? The bigger question is, who are we fighting and why?
Well, you will notice in the last 2 or 3 administrations, something has happened that's ought to be talked about. It used to be that the most important cabinet position, the primary position, was the Secretary of State. In the last 3 administrations, primary position is the Secretary of Defense. And in part, that's because instead of the last resort, military response has become enormously convenient and is often the first response. We still have, we got out of Afghanistan, but we still have active military units, special units, secret units involved in over a dozen countries. And every now and then something happens in Somalia, for example, and we realize that we have troops that are shooting people in Somalia. And the same is true in many other countries that never make it to the newspapers because you can't keep up with it. So we have created a country that I think our founding fathers would be aghast to see. And we created a country that even as recently as the beginning of the last century would have been absolutely unimaginable. And yet we have it.
Paul McBride, what a fascinating story, a fascinating history here. Since you're retired now, you have time to write a book about this, and I'll even spot you the title, The Origins of the ROTC. On the next episode of History as It Happens, remembering Colin Powell.
Iraq's behavior demonstrates that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
Historian Jeffrey Engel will join us to assess the legacy of a man who was once one of the most respected military and political figures in the country, if not the world. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.